The night the sky broke, Helen was elbow-deep in a chest cavity on the second floor of Troy General, listening to a man's heart struggle to remember what rhythm meant. The explosion hit at 11:47 p.m. She felt it before she heard it, a pressure change, like the world swallowing. The windows flexed inward without breaking. The monitors flatlined for 3 seconds and came back. Every dog within earshot lost its mind. She finished closing the chest, told the ORS team to hold their positions, and didn't look up until the patient was stable. By the time she got to a window, the sky to the north was the color of a bruise healing in fast forward. Green-white, then amber, then a deep arterial red that had nothing to do with any meteor she'd seen in 44 years of looking at the sky. She stood there with bloody gloves still on, watching it pulse. The man on the table behind her breathed. The monitors beeped. Outside, the siren started. She went home at 4 in the morning, walking because her car wouldn't start. And somewhere on Division Street she passed a black horse, standing perfectly still in the snow. It watched her. She watched it back. It didn't belong there and seemed to know it, standing with the dignified wrongness of something that had wandered through a door and couldn't find the way back. She kept walking. The horse stayed. That was the first night. She would mark time from it forever after. The veil didn't arrive the way the movies had promised. No ships, no announcement, no towering machines burning cities to glass, while news helicopters captured the money shot. They came like weather, like a change in air pressure that never quite resolved. Like the feeling you get in the moment before you remember something important. That hollow, reaching sensation that lives in the gap between knowing and knowing that you know. By the third day, 12 people in the Lansingburg neighborhood were standing against walls, not unconscious, not dead, eyes open, tracking movement occasionally, responding to names sometimes. Empty behind the eyes, in a way that bypassed every clinical descriptor Helen had been trained to use. She'd seen dissociation, she'd seen catatonia, she'd seen the 10,000-yard stare in veterans whose minds had quietly packed up and relocated. This was different. This was not absence. This was replacement. She documented it. She photographed eyes. She measured pupillary response and took blood and got on the phone with the state health department and the CDC and anyone else who would listen, which turned out to be nobody very useful. The words they kept using were mass psychogenic illness, shared traumatic response, post-event dissociative episode. She kept using the word harvested, and people kept not writing it down. On day 5, the first man presented with burst blood vessels in both eyes. He said he'd heard something just before. A frequency, he said, the way he might say gravity or tide. A natural force, not a sound. It had peaked, and then he was on the floor, and the capillaries in his eyes had simply given up. He'd been a machinist. His hands were steady. His hands were than Helen's that morning when she examined him, because he was calm in a way that she was beginning to recognize. The calm of something that had been partially replaced, that still wore his face and used his words, but kept looking at her with eyes that were measuring something she couldn't see. She drove home that evening and found Roy in the kitchen, making coffee. Roy, who was 68, and built like a man who'd spent his life lifting things and setting them down, who had hands the size of dinner plates, and a laugh that started somewhere around his knees. For Tape, who had been the same for 31 years of marriage. He was standing at the counter, making coffee, and he handed her a cup, and she looked at his eyes. She set the cup down and left the house. She had a daughter once, Mara, who would have been 22. There'd been a car accident when Mara was 4. And Helen had done everything right. She was a medic. She knew how to do everything right, and it hadn't mattered. There are things that knowing doesn't prevent. She had learned that, early and professionally, and it had not made it easier. In the bedroom closet, she still kept a small cedar box with things inside it. A hospital bracelet, a yellow sock with a duck on it, 3 photographs, a drawing of a horse that Mara had made when she was 3. The horse had 5 legs and a tail made of scribble, and it was the best horse Helen had ever seen. She kept it because the act of keeping it was something she chose. A small act of refusal. The world took the child. She kept the drawing. She sat in her car to park in a parking lot off Broadway and held the drawing for a long time. The temperature outside was 11 degrees. She didn't run the engine. She looked at the five-legged horse and said Mara's name out loud 3 times. Because 3 felt right, because that was something she did when the grief came back. And she needed to locate herself. Name the grief, hold the thing. Come back. She came back. She always came back. She drove to the hospital and started making lists. The veil frequency, she started frequencies in the clinical language in the private clinical in isolation meals because there was no one left to develop it with her. Operated in a range that human ears could not perceive but that human bodies could not ignore. She worked that out partly through examination and partly through the fact that she herself could feel it at the edges. A tightening behind the eyes, a sense of reaching towards something just beyond comprehension. Like trying to read in a dream. She felt it, and then she didn't, because she went to the cedar box and held the drawing, and the frequency, whatever it was doing, however it worked, could not quite get purchase on a mind that was actively, stubbornly, pointedly, insisting on remembering a five-legged horse. She didn't know why she was resistant. She developed a theory, and it was not a comfortable theory. Grief, properly metabolized, might be the one cognitive state that the veil frequency couldn't map. Not because it was incoherent. Grief is profoundly coherent. Grief is the body's most precise accounting of what was real. But because it lived in a register that required 2 contradictory things to be true simultaneously. She is gone. She was here, the frequency, as near as Helen could tell, rewrote. It found the gaps in certainty and widened them. Grief left no gaps. Grief was all certainty. The worst, most accurate certainty. Mara was gone and had been here, and Helen remembered her with the unforgiving precision of someone's who had spent 18 years, proving she would not forget. Fact, she thought. Filing this under a heading she called Resistance Mechanics might be the only advantage she had. She wrote it down. Writing it down was its own form of resistance. Every morning she wrote the date, the names of people she loved, the names of people lost, the five-legged horse. The drawing was folded now in her coat pocket, worn at the creases, because she had been carrying it for 3 weeks. On day 18, the stone head came down the river. She heard about it from a nurse named Priya, who was still herself, still Priya, still had the laugh that started with a snort that she'd never learned to suppress and never tried. Priya called her from the riverbank where she'd gone to see it. A massive carved stone head, 8 feet tall, descending the Hudson on some invisible current, revolving slowly, face upward, serene as a judge. It was not any head that had been there the day before. Helen drove to the river. She stood on the bank with maybe 40 other people who were still enough themselves to come and look. And she watched the head turn in the slow black water. It was not a meteor fragment. It was not debris from any building she knew. It had been made. The features were deliberate, stylized in a way that was almost recognizable, and then wasn't. The way a face glimpsed at the edge of sleep isn't quite a face. It revolved and receded downriver and left a silence that lasted too long. It was a marker. She knew it in her stomach before she knew it in her mind. The veil were marking. The meteor had been a signal, not to humans, to themselves. This is ours now. We have begun. The head was a claim stake planted in a river. Visible, deliberate, meant to be seen, which meant they knew she could still see, which meant they were not trying very hard to stop her. She went back to the hospital and found Priya and said, quietly, in the break room with the lights off, I need you to help me understand what they are before they finish. Priya looked at her with the clear eyes of someone still all the way in her own head. She said, what do you need? Helen had a list. She had been mapping the affected. Not just clinically, spatially. She'd put a paper map of Troy on the wall of the supply closet, pins for each presentation, red for the standing against walls cases, blue for the burst capillaries, yellow for the people who'd gone missing and whose bodies hadn't been found. The yellow pins had been accumulating. The pattern wasn't geographic. She'd expected a ground zero, an epicenter near the meteor impact site north of the city. There wasn't one. The affected were distributed along social networks, not physical proximity. A family here, a shift at a warehouse there. People who had been in sustained and close contact with someone who'd been touched by the frequency first. Not contagion in any biological sense. The blood panels came back unremarkable, but something traveling along channels of human connection. The veil frequency found people through people. It used relationship as infrastructure, which meant, she wrote, the most isolated people might be the last one standing, which was a terrible thing to know, because isolation had its own costs, and she'd always believed connection was survival, which meant that survival, under current conditions, required something that was almost the opposite of everything she'd learned about keeping people alive, and which meant that she and Priya, standing in a supply closet, whispering about alien cognitive invasion, were probably safer together than either alone, but that they were also becoming a vulnerability for each other. And she could see, even as she reached this conclusion, why the Veil had designed it this way. They were very good at the loneliness problem. They had done this before. The horse came back on day 23. She saw it at dusk, standing at the end of her street, in the snow, in the same spot where it had stood on the first night. It was a draft horse, she thought. Percheron, maybe, or some cold-blooded breed built for winter. Black as something that had decided to be black deliberately. It was watching the house, not skittish, not feral, watchful in the way that large animals are watchful, with the full weight of their attention and none of the performance. She went out to it. She knew this was not a sensible thing to do. She stood in the snow in her coat with the drawing in her pocket, and she looked at the horse, and the horse looked at her, and she thought about Mara, who had loved horses with the specific passionate derangement of a 3-year-old, who has discovered that an animal much larger than herself will nevertheless suffer her to approach. The horse put its head down. Not submission, consideration, she thought. It was considering her. She reached out, and it allowed her hand on its neck, and the warmth of it was startling. That animal warmth that is always a surprise, because the body forgets that other bodies generate it too. That warmth is not a human proprietary. She stayed there for a long time. The horse didn't leave. She went inside eventually, and when she looked from the window, it was still there. And she thought, something has not been rewritten. Something's is still running on its own operating system. Something has no gaps for the frequency to enter, because it has no language to insert the frequency into. No story about itself that can be revised. No identity made of concepts that can be quietly, surgically swapped. She wrote, the animals are still themselves. The horse is still a horse. The question is whether there is anything in me that is horse enough to hold. Priya brought her a patient on day 26. A man named Gerald, 50-something, who had been affected, clearly, by his eyes, but who kept snapping back, briefly, flickeringly, the way a radio station cuts through static for a moment, before losing the frequency again. She timed the intervals. She watched what brought him back. His wife's voice saying his specific name, not Gerald, not Ger, but G, the name she'd used for him since 1987, and which no one else on Earth used. When she said G, he came back. For 30-40 seconds, then slipped again. She asked his wife to tell her about him. What did he love? What did he hate? What were the things that were only his, not his job, not his social role, the irreducible things? She took notes for 2 hours. The wife talked like a woman who had been waiting her whole life for someone to finally ask. She talked about the way he ate cereal, the specific sequence of adding milk before cereal because he'd always done it backward. And when she'd pointed it out 20 years ago, he'd said, so what? It's my bowl. She talked about how he whistled without knowing he was whistling. Fragments of songs he never completed. She talked about the morning he'd cried at a commercial. Actually cried, face in his hands, because it had shown an old man being visited by his grandchildren, and Gerald had never met his grandfather and always felt the lack of it in a specific way he'd described to her once and never mentioned again. Helen listened and transcribed and thought, this is the data they cannot replicate. Not because it is complex, the Veil were clearly capable of complexity, but because it is irrelevant. It is the kind of information that no system optimized for efficiency would retain. The cereal bowl, the unfinished whistling, the grandfather he never met, and the commercial that broke him open. These are the things that live in the gaps between what a person is for and what a person is. The Veil frequency, she was increasingly certain, was a system optimized for function. It preserved the functions, placed the interstices. And the interstices were all of it. The interstices were the whole point. She found a frequency generator in the physics department at the community college on day 29. She found it because Priya knew a professor who'd been studying infrasound before all this, and who was now standing in his office looking at the wall with the particular stillness of a man whose interstices had been removed. She took the equipment. She left a note apologizing, on the off chance he ever came back to read it. She didn't know enough physics. She was a medic. She knew the body in the way a mechanic knows an engine. Functionally, practically, with a deep respect for what she didn't understand about the underlying principles. She knew that the veil frequency was causing physical harm. The capillaries. The cascade of cognitive displacement, which meant it was operating in a physical medium, which meant it could theoretically be interfered with. She didn't know how. She knew enough to know she didn't know. She called the only person she could think of who might know. A former patient, a woman named Soo Jin, who had been an acoustic engineer before she'd had the accident that brought her to Helen's table 3 years ago, and who had sent Helen a card every year since because that was who Soo Jin was. Helen had sent cards back because that was who Helen was becoming, slowly, under the influence of people like Soo Jin. She still had the most recent card. She called the number on it. Soo Jin answered. Clear voice, clear eyes. She lived in Cohos, far enough from the initial event that the frequency hadn't fully reached. She said she'd been watching the news, such as it was, and she'd been thinking. She said, come to me, or I'll come to you. Helen said, come to me. I have equipment and a map and a theory, and I need someone to tell me where the theory breaks. Soo Jin arrived the next morning with a truck full of acoustic equipment and a thermos of coffee and the focused, slightly dangerous expression of an engineer who has identified a problem and is now personally offended by it. They worked for 6 days. On the 35th day, Helen's hands stopped shaking. She noticed this at 4 in the morning, sitting on the floor of the supply closet, with the map and the frequency calculations, and Mara's drawing pinned to the wall above the pins. Her hands had been shaking, intermittently, for over a month. Not fear. She'd made her peace with fear in the first week, but the particular tremor that lives in the body when the mind is holding something very heavy for a very long time. She looked at her hands in the fluorescent light. They were still. She thought about Roy. She thought about him the way she let herself, which was not the fantasy of reversal, but the accurate accounting. Roy, standing in the kitchen handing her a cup of coffee, in the gesture of a man who had handed her coffee 1,000 times, and would never know how much that specific repeated gesture had constituted him. Roy laughing from his knees. Roy who had been replaced by something that used his face and his hands, and none of the spaces in between, and she had walked out and not gone back, because going back and looking at the thing wearing his face was the one grief she could not metabolize into resistance. Some griefs are not armor. Some griefs are just grief. She let it be grief. She didn't try to convert it. She said his name, once in the empty supply closet. Then she looked at her still hands and said, okay, let's finish. The counterfrequency was not elegant. Soo Jin was very clear about this. She kept saying it, apologetically, as if elegance were a clinical requirement. It was a brute force solution. A counter-propagating wave at a specific infrasonic frequency, generated from 4 points distributed across the city at the vertices of a calculated interference pattern, that would, in theory, in very careful theory, disrupt the veil signal not by overpowering it but by entrenching enough noise into its propagation medium that it could no longer maintain the coherence it needed to do the cognitive work. Like trying to read in a room where someone has scattered every letter of the alphabet across the floor. The letters are all there. The message cannot be assembled. It would not reverse damage already done. That was the hard part. The people standing against walls. Some of them had been standing a long time. The replacement had gone deep. She did not know what came back, if anything, when the signal stopped. She did not know if coming back was the right word for what happened to a mind that had been partially rebuilt. She was a field medic with acoustic equipment, and a dead husband, and a dead daughter, and a map full of pins. And she had done the best science she could, and it was not enough to answer every question. She placed the first generator at the corner of Congress and Ferry at 3 in the morning on the 39th day, in the snow. She wore a backpack and walked like she was going somewhere specific and normal, because that was the skill she'd developed. Move like you belong to the world that remains. The streets were quiet. Two people she passed were standing at building faces, arms at their sides, the familiar posture. She noted them on her map. She kept moving. Priya placed the second generator. Su Jin placed the third. A man named David, Gerald's brother, who had stayed himself through proximity to Gerald's wife's voice, through the sheer unrelenting specificity of a 40-year relationship spoken aloud, placed the fourth. They communicated by text. No voice calls. She'd had a suspicion, still unconfirmed, that the veil could leverage the frequency of human voice communication in ways that text did not provide. Maybe wrong. She didn't know. She was working with the knowledge she had, and the knowledge she lacked, and the gap between them, and she was moving anyway. 4:17 a.m., Priya texted, in position, at 4:19 Sujin, ready. At 4:21 David, okay. Helen stood at the corner of Congress and Ferry, with her generator in a backpack, and Mara's drawing in her pocket, and her hands around a thermos that had gone cold, and she stood there for a long moment in the dark and the snow, and she thought about the stone head turning in the river, deliberate and unhurried, and she thought about the horse that was still a horse, and she thought about Gerald's wife, talking for 2 hours about the cereal bowl and the unfinished whistling, and she thought about the things that constitute a person in the interstices between function and form, the irreducibly useless specific accumulated texture of a human life. And she thought, they did not understand what they were trying to rewrite. They could see the content, and they could not see the container. They found the gaps and widened them, and filled them with something coherent and functional and utterly wrong, like a restorer who has repainted a canvas in colors that are technically accurate and have lost everything. She activated the generator. The results were not dramatic. She had not expected drama. Drama was for people who had not spent their careers in emergency medicine, where the most important moments almost always looked like nothing. A hand pressed to a wound, a number read off a monitor, a decision made in the time it takes to blink. The generators activated and produced, in theory, the counter frequency, and the snow kept falling, and the street stayed quiet, and nothing visible changed. 30 minutes later, a woman 2 blocks north sat down. She had been standing against a wall for 11 days. The snow, and put her hands on her face, and made a sound that Helen, approaching, recognized. The sound of a person who has come back to themselves, and found that time has passed without them, and the world has moved, and they are still in the place where they stopped, and everything that was true then is still true but changed by the interval, with a timestamp. She put her hands on the woman's shoulders and said, I'm a medic, I'm right here, gonna stay right here. The woman looked at her and said, it was cold, Helen said, I know, stay with me. She texted the others, something is happening. Priya responded in 40 seconds, same here, 2 people. They're sitting down. Sujin 3, one of them is crying. Is that good, David? Gerald just said his wife's name. Helen read that last one 3 times. She sat in the snow next to a woman she didn't know and read David's text 3 times and felt something in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite grief and was maybe the thing between them, the unnamed thing that knows both are true simultaneously. Gerald had said his wife's name. The frequency was breaking up. The spaces between what a person is for and what a person is were reasserting themselves. All that irreducible, useless, specific, accumulated texture pushing back through the noise like static that turns out to be the signal. She thought about Roy. She sat very still in the snow and let herself think about Roy, the full accounting, the accurate one. The coffee handed across 1,000 mornings, the laugh from his knees, the hands the size of dinner plates, and she did not know. She would not know for some time whether the counter-frequency was enough to reach what the veil had replaced, whether the deep replacement could be undone, whether the man in the kitchen with the empty eyes was still in it behind the replacement waiting, or whether the replacement had gone so deep that what came back would only be a shape. She didn't know. She was a field medic with a map and a dead daughter and a theory she'd built in a supply closet, and 4 people willing to stand in the cold and activate generators at 4 in the morning. And she had done what she could do with what she had. That was the only sentence available to her. She had learned it early, and she had learned it professionally. And she had never fully made her peace with it, and she never would. The woman beside her had stopped shaking. She was looking at the sky, where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to distinguish itself from the darkness, and her eyes were clear. Said, "What's your name?" the woman said. "Sandra." "Pellegrino. Okay, Sandra. Can you tell me something true? Something small. Something that only you would know." Sandra looked at her. She thought for a moment. She said, "My mother used to put too much salt in everything, and I never told her because she was proud of her cooking." Helen said, "Good, that's good. Hold on to that." She meant it clinically. She meant it every other way too. The Vael did not leave. She had not expected them to leave. A counter-frequency was not a weapon. It was a brace, a tourniquet, a way to hold the wound open until something more permanent could be built. She was a field medic. She understood the difference between stopping the bleeding and fixing what had been cut. But in the days that followed, in the weeks, in the cold and tentative recovery that came back to Troy, the way circulation comes back to a limb that has been compressed, painfully, unevenly, with a strange burning that was somehow welcome. People came back. Not all of them, not all the way. Sandra Pellegrino came back, and the man with the bloodburst eyes came back and could name the sound he'd heard now, and was furious about it in a way that seemed healthy. And 3 of the standing against walls cases came back and 2 did not, and she documented all of it with the same careful precision she'd applied to everything since the first night, because precision was the form her stubbornness took. She did not go back to the house on Division Street immediately. She waited 2 more weeks, until the generators had been running long enough that she was reasonably confident the counter-frequency was holding, and then she went. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and looked at the door for a long time. The front walk had not been shoveled. She had the thought, clearly and without sentimentality, that Roy always shoveled the front walk. She had always been annoyed by how he piled the snow, high on the left side and low on the right, asymmetric in a way that was purely Roy, a small, useless idiosyncrasy that made no difference to anyone. She shoveled the walk before she went in. She piled the snow high on the left side. Roy was in the kitchen. He looked at her, and she looked at him. She was looking for the eyes. The eyes were the tell. The measurement she'd made 1,000 times now. The clinical calibration between presence and replacement. His eyes tracked her, moved to her face. Something shifted in them that was not a medical phenomenon she could name. That was not in any rubric she'd developed. That was not data. He said, "You shoveled the walk." She said, "Yeah." He said, "You always pile it wrong." She said nothing. She stood in the doorway of her kitchen for a long time and looked at the man she'd been married to for 31 years and tried to determine, with the precision she'd applied to everything, what was true. She did not know. She would be determining this, probably, for the rest of her life. She came in and closed the door. She set Mara's drawing on the kitchen table between them, the 5-legged horse, the scribble tail, and she said, "Do you know what this is?" Roy looked at it. His hands were still. His face was doing something she recognized and could not quite name. He said, "Mara drew that. She was 3. She showed it to me and said the horse needed 1 more leg for the trip." Helen sat down. Roy sat down. The horse in the drawing had 5 legs and a tail made of scribble, and it was the best horse either of them had ever seen. And outside the window, the black horse was standing in the street again, in the snow, in the early light, watching the house with the full, unhurried weight of its attention. Not waiting for anything, not going anywhere. Just present, in the particular animal way that means, I am what I am, and I have not been otherwise, and I will not be. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at Roy. She said, "It needed 1 more leg for the trip." Roy said, "Yeah." The snow kept falling. The generators kept running. Somewhere in the recovery that was still becoming itself, people were learning to hold on to the small, true things. The cereal poured wrong, the unfinished whistling, the too salted food, the lopsided snow pile, and finding that the small, true things were doing what small, true things had always done. Holding the shape of a person against the forces that would simplify them, against everything that would rewrite the interstices and leave a functioning copy with nothing left in the gaps where the person actually lived. The veil had come to Troy, New York, and found that the minds they were optimized to rewrite contained something they had not modeled, the irreducibly, stubbornly, pointlessly specific, the details that served no function, the grief that wouldn't resolve into data. The five-legged horse drawn by a child who saw no reason a horse couldn't have 5 legs for the trip. They had found, in short, that humans were not built efficiently, that the gaps between function and form were not errors to be corrected, that what lived in those gaps was not weakness. Helen had known this for 18 years in the way you know things that have cost you everything to learn. She had written it down. She had kept the drawing. She had refused, with the full force of her unreasonable, unoptimized, specifically human stubbornness, to let it be simplified. That, in the end, was all it had taken. That, and 4 generators, and Priya's snort law, and an acoustic engineer with a thermos, and Gerald's wife talking for 2 hours about the cereal bowl. They had held the shape held. Outside, the horse turned and walked slowly down the street and disappeared around the corner, unhurried, heading somewhere in the way that horses head somewhere, with the complete confidence of a thing that does not doubt its own direction. Helen watched it go. She said, "I should make coffee." Roy said, "I'll do it." She let him. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the worn wood surface and her daughter's drawing between them, and she let the ordinary world, imperfect, asymmetric, full of the small wrong things that were the most right things she knew, she let it come back the way circulation comes back, burning and welcome in hers.